Welcome to the BookBlast podcast. Our international podcast series, Bridging the Divide, Translation and the Art of Empathy, showcases a selection of the best writing in translation from around the world being published this year in the UK by 10 leading independent houses and a special guest. I'll now hand over to my co-host, Lucy Popescu.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be able to interview Goran Vojnović and his English translator, Olivia Hellewell. Spanning 3 generations, The Fig Tree is a compelling portrait of a family defined by absence and the fragmentation of former Yugoslavia. Jadran suspects his grandfather, Alexander, of having committed suicide, and his longing for knowledge and closure sends him on a quest to better understand his family and a darkness that they all seem to share on some level. His Bosnian father, Safet, leaves them when he is 10, and his partner, Anya, disappears on 2 occasions. Goran, as well as a novelist, you're a screenwriter and film director, a poet and columnist. What's your preferred medium?
Well, at the moment I'm finishing my new novel, and I'm also writing a screenplay and something for theater. So I would say writer. Also, if I look at the situation, writing is what I can do without any restrictions. But I'm also in the same time filmmaker, because I have film that it's finished and we are waiting for the opportunity to show it to people. So yes, I'm switching still, but between film and literature. But I think as I grow older, I realize that writing is what suits me more and suits my family more. So yeah, I think I'm going to write more and film less in years to come.
And what inspired the subject and themes of The Fig Tree?
Well, I should say many things, but to put it simpler, I would say my life, because inside of this novel are 2 main topics that were also topics in my previous novel. That's one topic is growing up in Slovenia, being non-Slovenian. And the second is disintegration of Yugoslavia, and especially the war. So these are my, I would say, main topics. But here also with this book, I wanted to write about many other things. Of course, there's a lot of things that I brought in from my own experience, and of course, the locations of this novel are all connected to me very deeply. So there isn't one thing that inspired the novel, but there is maybe a scene I imagined where it all began. Is a scene of the person who left everything and went looking of complete freedom, who cut all the ties to his previous life and just went down the river to some other world. And that was a scene in my head, and I went from there. But then, of course, I came back to me, myself, my memories, my world.
And it is about so many things, which hopefully we'll explore in this podcast. But why did you decide to call it The Fig Tree?
Well, from the beginning I had this title because when I say the fig tree, and in the original, it's not necessarily a tree. It can also be just a fig, because in Slovenian, the fig tree and the fig is both. It's the same word, and it just, when I say this, it opens up the whole world. It's a special fig tree. Is a fig tree that stands in the garden near the house of my grandparents. So it opens this word opens so many things to me, and it opens all world from which this novel grew from. I moved this fig then to the other part of Istria, some 100 kilometers northern, and of course these characters that are in the novel are not like copy pasted from my life. They are not real characters. The grandfather is not my grandfather, but they all are coming from this world, from this fig tree. So, and I said that this is what actually makes language and literature and poetry interesting, is that every word opens up for every one of us different things, but somehow we still understand each other. So I left at the end this title, which is very elusive, I would say, but it's in a way it's also tells you that the novel it's also elusive in a similar way.
I mean, you mentioned that it was inspired by real events and real people. So how autobiographical are the stories you tell?
Well, they're very autobiographical, but I'm not writing autofiction. What I do is that I take my memories, things that really happen, but then I start playing with them. I put them in a different perspective. I put them in a different surrounding. I put myself actually into different circumstances. I imagine alternative possibilities for me and for my family, and so basically I dress them in fiction. So everything, if you look to this novel, there's a lot of things that are really autobiographical, but when I'm writing, I let myself to be free to develop the story, to be a story, to be a literature. Like, for example, Alexander and his death, it has a lot of similarity with the death of my grandfather, and he himself has a lot of similarities, but I treat him as a totally fictional character, and then I added, of course, this suspicion that he committed suicide, which is totally fiction, and then I go along and play with it, and the same goes with all the other parts of the story. So I imagine that I put a lot of my father into the Safed, but then my father would never left, and I imagine I do add something to Safed, which made him go away, and then I imagine what happens from then on. So this is what I do actually, and I enjoy it the most when I go really far, but still when I'm still connected to my real life and my own experience. I think the most important question for me when I'm writing is what if, because I always imagine what if this what I feel, or who I am, or who are the people who I know, what if this and that happened to them, where would it lead me or somebody I know?
And why is the past important?
Well, for me, past is all I have when I write. When I'm writing, I don't know about the future. I'm even bored when I'm trying to imagine the future. But past is interesting because I can play with it. I can make things differently, but root them in the really real past, and it's a playfield actually. And then of course it's very important if you want to understand what's happening with I think here it's in Balkans, but I think it's not different if you look anywhere else. We are producing a lot of history. The past is always very present in our present. So it's of course from the childhood you are like pushed into this understanding of the past, into learning of the past, so you are able to understand what is going on. Because I remember when I was 11 years old and the war started, you were forced to really look into the past so you would be able to understand what is going on at the moment in front of your eyes, because without knowledge of the past, this was for me, and for not just for me, but also for my parents and our friends, it was completely crazy. It's nobody. It didn't make any sense, and so I think that's why it's not just me, but most of the writers from Balkans, but also from everywhere else, they are obsessed with the past, because they're trying to understand not just the present and everything, but also the human beings. They search for some logic explanation, and of course, it's rarely you find logic into when you talk about mankind.
Yeah. And what draws you to write about outsiders?
Well, as I said before, I grew up in Slovenia being a non-Slovenian, and that wasn't such a big problem until the war came, and suddenly me being outsider was a topic, was something that you felt, and it was some world. It was like world suddenly was made anew. Like Slovenians and non-Slovenians, but as soon as you cross the border, there was Croatian and non-Croatians, or Bosnians and non-Bosnians, Serbs and non-Serbs. It was suddenly very important, and it was so easy to be outsider, to feel outsider. And of course, later in life, you discover that, of course, you can be outsider in many different ways, but the first my experience with being outsider is to speak a different language, is to be the son of the two immigrants. Luckily, they were not illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
My parents, and technically they weren't even real immigrants, because they just moved to the northern part of their own country. But as soon as that country, Slovenia, separated, we were like called immigrants, and of course some not so nice words.
Yeah.
So this was the part of my experience as I grew up, and I think it made me who I am. Of course, I'm not seeing myself today as an outsider, but it's still a topic that very much interests me. And when I start writing, I sort of automatically start writing about outsiders, and I also believe that in a way everyone is an outsider. In a way, it's not necessary to be non-Slovenian. A lot of Slovenians are outsiders. Everybody has some point where he can feel being outsider. So it's what we are, how we deal with the insider and outsider in ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And just building on that, I mean, the story is partly set in the Slovene capital, Ljubljana, and partly in the village of Momjan. Did you grow up in a rural or urban community? And what did you want the reader to take away from your portrait of three countries, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, but also two different settings, the rural and the urban?
Well, I grew up in Ljubljana, in a Fužine, which is very urban area, but is a mixture. Its culture is mixture of urban and rural, because a lot of people, like my father, for example, came to live to Ljubljana from rural areas, and they brought their way of life with them. So it was the life in Fužine, with in this neighborhood of Ljubljana, wasn't typically urban. It has a lot of rural characteristics. So, and it's this combination of rural and urban. It's part of me, because my father is coming from a smaller town in Bosnia, from a village actually, and my mother is coming from Pula, from capital of Istria, which is very urban part of Croatia coast, and I have it both this, let's say, cultures in me. I'm the mixture of those two, and I'm living with both of them all my life, even though I live in Ljubljana all that period. And when I'm writing, I think both these worlds are just coming through me, and of course, and I said before that the location of this novel are all deeply connected to me, and when I say my homeland, of course, I'm coming from Slovenia. I'm a Slovenian writer, but when I'm thinking about my homeland, it goes across the border. It goes to Croatia. It goes to the parts of Bosnia. It's much wider than today Slovenia, because I'm bilingual. My first language is Serbo-Croatian, or Yugoslavian language, the one that it's now separated into 4 different languages, but I referred to this language in my novel as Naški, which would mean our language. So this is my world. This is where I see myself as home, and I'm very much connected to this part of the world, but not as I don't see this as a country. I belong to the language and culture and to some people. And when I say like Bosnia, I think also at 1 tree and 2 houses and maybe 1 graveyard, and I see people, and and stories, I think, and memories. This is what I'm referring to when I speak of my homeland. So this is why all my novels are taking place in this area, I would say.
And when Alexander is in Cairo in the 1980s, his wife Jana moves to Ljubljana and experiences a sense of liberation. Why is this? Because of his absence? Because she's living in a city? Or something else?
Well, you can say it's a combination of all of these things, but I think one thing is that roles in the Yugoslavian society were very strict, even though that communism did make progress when we talk about women's rights, and they were able to finish schools, become, I don't know, doctors, lawyers, or politicians, everything. But the roles stayed the same. The women were somehow still expected to take care of the family, to stay at home, no matter how emancipated they were, or how liberal their husbands were. So I think as long as Alexander stayed with his wife Jana, she was accustomed to her role of woman, and only after he left, she saw the opportunity to do something else with her life, to live her life differently, because before she was, of course, the wife of the man. So that's in a way I wanted to show how a lot of women in that period, they didn't really get the opportunity to live the life they would live if they would just be for them to decide what kind of life we're living. And for Jana, that happens. Of course, she moves to the city and just spontaneously starts doing what she would like to do, because first she's bored, and then she discovers that there's a lot of things she would actually love to do, and that she can do it because she doesn't have no more obligations toward the society, her husband, toward nobody. And she just starts living differently, and then she starts enjoying it. And then, of course, she's dreading the moment when everything would go back as it was, because she can't really imagine herself going back to this way of life where she would be at home, taking care of home, and be just the wife of Mr. Director.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Thank you. And Safet, when he returns to Bosnia just before the war, does not feel that same sense of liberation. But he does not return to his family when he can. Why? And could Dane, the brother-in-law, have helped Safet?
Well, I deliberately left this question not really answered. What happened to Dane? Why he went to Bosnia? And it keeps popping up in the discussions about my book, and I'm wondering, maybe I should have explained it more, because I really understand this character. Maybe I understand it too much, and because what I see with Safet, and what I wanted to show, is how he was, how weak men can be, and how this patriarchal system can be can also terrorize men. Not, of course, the women are the main victims, but also the men, because they are supposed to be strong and supposed to be winning this game with life, with a system, with everything. And all the time Safet is playing with the system and winning. These small victories he does when he's somehow trying to overcome all the obstacles in this not really functioning system of ex-Yugoslavia. He looks like he owns the place. He's very strong-minded. He knows everyone. Everybody knows him. He does everything he likes to do, no matter what. And then at one point, suddenly this system outplays him, and he's defeated, and he feels ashamed, and he can't stand it, because actually he's very weak, because he cannot stand that system, and everybody that represent this system in his head defeated him, and he feels so much shame that, of course, Dane could help him, but Safet should let him help him, which he can, because he's not the one who needs help. He's the one helping others. That's where his power is coming from, to be able to be better than the rest, to win these little games that life makes him play. And I think I deeply understand this shame, and this, when this weakness finally overcomes him, and he just can't bear it, and he just runs away, and he doesn't have a strength inside of him to come back and ask for help, to say, okay, I lost. I was not able to foresee what the future brings. I was not able to ask and beg for help. And this is this weakness of men that is lying underneath this image of very powerful, strong-minded men, and this is what I think it's what is very, if you look all the patriarchal systems, when you look at outside, men are really strong and always also aggressive and everything, but underneath I think is a huge weakness, and they're not able to show it. They cannot show it, and then when they're finally forced to show their weakness, they fall apart. And this is, I think, what happened to Safet.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to unpack it and to hear you sort of explain it, because I was so enthralled in the book and with the characters that I was like, why won't he come back? I was desperate to, for him to come back. You were really rooting for it. And then there's that moment when Jadran visits his father in Bosnia a few years after he's left. I think Jadran's 16. And it's dominated, those passages, is dominated by the river Una. Can you talk about why the river is so important to Safet? And I'm thinking in particular of that wonderful scene where the estranged father and son uncomfortably go to swim together in the river.
Yeah, I think the river is the one where he really can remove himself from the land, where he can be really free and removed, because he comes back, but actually he doesn't feel really connected to this world. This is not really his world. It's the world of his family, where it's his father home. Actually, he never lived there, and he doesn't have relatives there. So yes, he comes back, but actually he has some memories from his childhood. It's not the real world. He's not feeling comfortable talking to people because he's an outsider. They are like fighting a war which he doesn't really understand, which is not his war. He doesn't want to belong on any side because he's having completely different problems in his life. And I think the river is actually the only place where he feels himself removed from both sides. It's maybe more symbolical than anything else in this novel, because he comes there when the war starts, and there's suddenly this world is separated into two sides, and he's in the middle in the river, like trying to say, I don't care about either of you, just leave me alone. And it's also, this river is connected to me because my grandmother comes from this Bosanska Otoka, and I also don't have really connection. I visited this place only when I was grown up, when I took my mother there, and to show us where the house of her grandmother was, and then we discovered that there is just a square and some post office. So there's nothing. So there is a really auto-fictional paragraph there explaining how Safet's family lost its fortune. That's really what happened to my family. Actually, it's basically transcript of what I've been told. How. So yeah, it's. I imagine Safet to have the same relationship, distant relationship to this place. I imagine, like, how would I be if I came there and have no real connection to this place? But because he is a Bosnian, then she should belong to Bosnia. But then again,
he doesn't. He's an outsider everywhere.
Yeah.
And the novel is also partly about the disintegration of communism and the rise of nationalism. In the present day, Anya, who's Jadran's partner, Anya's father, Miro, and Jadran's uncle, Dane, both appear to have influence. What are you suggesting? That money, past affiliations, or something else holds the biggest sway today?
Well, I think still in such a small country as Slovenia, sometimes the connections are what counts. Of course, money helps, but sometimes people are just well connected. They know how to play the game. Basically, you don't really need enormous amount of money to be able to play the game. The ones that people who play this game of influence and power and everything, they're not really rich necessarily. They are just well connected, and they know which button you have to press with certain people to get what you want. And so not Miro maybe is the richer of the two you mentioned, but it's not just the money. It's how they connection, and also to be able to put yourself in the right position in every time. It was a lot of people who are successful now were successful before. they weren't really victims of transition, and still main Slovenian politicians are ex-communists. So those are the people that were actually built for success. They just knew where to be and how to act in every system. You could put them no matter where, they would find themselves on top, because what they want is to be on top, and they don't have very strong beliefs. They just ask themselves, okay, what I need to do and say to be able to succeed.
For English readers, which characters do you hope we will most empathise with? And by writing about flawed characters, you remind us of our shared humanity. Was that always your intention?
Well, I see people as flawed, so it's not that my intention, but that's just what comes when I write about people. With English readers, it will be same as with any other readers. It's more with which sex you are, or which generation you belong. This is my experience, that you connect with a character which is maybe you have the most connection to, older women or the younger. It's different kind of connection, not necessarily that your Englishness, if I can say so, will prevail, but I think much more intimate characteristic will decide which characters you will find closer to you.
Thank you. And we're very lucky to have Olivia here as well. Olivia, how did you become a translator?
Hi. Well, I guess I feel like I'm still becoming one, and that's a nice feeling now. I think at some point it might have made me feel anxious, and I would have been waiting for a moment where I realised that yes, now I am a literary translator, but I'm actually really enjoying the process at the moment. But in concrete terms, I suppose I've always been someone that's loved learning languages and someone that's loved reading books. So I suppose looking back, it seems quite obvious that this is what I might end up doing. I studied languages at university and started learning Slovene as a postgraduate student. And I was really lucky at the time that I was surrounded by some really amazing and enthusiastic people in the department who put on, in particular, literary evenings, and authors from Slovenia would be invited to Nottingham University, and of which Goran was one at one time, I think back in 2015 maybe. And with some of the other students, we would translate short excerpts of authors' work to share with the public who would come to these events. And so that was a really good way of getting started, because we had that kind of collaborative network of students and the language tutors here. But we got to share our work, and we also felt like we were sharing other people's stories, which was a real buzz. So I think that's when I started to realise that that is something that I enjoyed doing and that I could get better at.
And how does translation unite people and increase empathy? You were almost beginning to say it in your description of those literary nights.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of potential layers to that question, and of course there are lots of practical examples where it does bring people together. And listening to Goran speak, I realised that I spent a lot of time studying the history of the former Yugoslavia, and I had a lot of factual knowledge about what happened, about the order of events, and sometimes quite detailed knowledge about certain aspects of that particular history. But through reading The Fig Tree, at first as a reader, I realised that I'd also been missing a lot of personal stories that you don't often get to hear the day-to-day. And so in that sense, reading, and particularly reading in translation, does have this really enticing potential to open us to new situations and to new scenarios that might otherwise have remained unknown to us. But I feel a bit of a but here, and I suppose there is a less fluffy side to the answer, where I think sometimes there are limits to what books can do. Books are books, and I think it's important not to be critical, but so that we're not... I wouldn't want to become complacent, and I think, to paraphrase a good friend of mine, books aren't social fairy dust. And so I like to bear that in mind, because I would hate to think that we would read books and then just innately think that we're doing something good. It's still upon us as readers to listen, to engage, and to still keep working and reading.
Yeah. And what were some of the challenges you faced when translating this text? And how did you work with Goran?
I find it hard to answer this question without mentioning the big practical elephant in the room, which was that just as I was about to start translating this novel, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So that was a huge challenge in terms of navigating how I approached the project and kind of accepting the limits of what I was able to do at that given moment in time. And I did and ah about whether I would bring that up today, but I think it's important that people realise that translations aren't created in a vacuum, and that there are, these very real circumstances that impact upon our work and how work is produced. But having said that, it became a treat to work on this book when I was feeling well enough. I was lucky to be very well supported by the publisher and by Goran as well, who was super patient and helpful. And it kind of took on extra meaning for me because of that. It was something I was still able to do and still hold on to, a part of who I was.
How hands-on was Goran in terms of the actual translation? Did you email him passages or speak to him, or did you just get on with it?
We had really good conversations, I felt. I would complete a certain number of chapters. I'd kind of get them to a standard that I was happy with where possible. I did feel time pressure with this project because of everything that was going on. So sometimes when I look back, I saw earlier drafts that I'd sent to Goran, and I would think, I really wish that I hadn't sent it to him at that stage. But I would send him sections at a time with questions in the comments, and he would just reply with his own insights, ideas. They make for really great reading. One day, maybe we should publish our chats in Microsoft Word comments, because there are sometimes I ask a question and Goran explains by replying with a joke, and then it would often take me just as much time to work out the joke as it would have done to try and solve the original problem.
Excellent.
But it was. I really enjoyed that process.
And what, in your view, makes a good translator?
I think time is a very important ingredient, because obviously we learn all the time. Our knowledge of language becomes deeper the more we read, the more we live and are immersed in certain cultural worlds. And I'm excited by that thought, to think, if I can do this now, what might I be able to do in 10, 20 years' time? And there are some translators, far on in their careers that I really admire and think, wow, they've such a body of work under their belt, and I really hope that I get the opportunity to do that. But I suppose some more concrete ingredients for me that make a good translator are being a really careful, attentive reader, not letting anything slip under your radar, like taking care to notice every nuance, and being a good writer. And I think as someone that learnt languages first, so I came at translation from a linguist perspective. So for me, the goal originally was to learn Slovene, this language that I was intrigued by and that I loved. And so the focus for a long time was on Slovene, on that second language. But I think as I've got older and the more I've listened to other more experienced translators talk, the more and more I realised that it was equally important that I focused and thought of myself as a writer, and therefore also kept reading as much in English as I tried to do in Slovene. So, I think it really, you have to be able to write.
And does it matter if the reader hears the original language in the work, or do you aim for a seamless translation?
I think that really depends on the project you're working on. I can imagine in some genres that seamless is the main goal that you would aim for. But with the fig tree, multilingualism is really integral to the plot. And so there were some instances where it was really important to show that these characters are speaking different languages. And this kind of goes back to one of the challenges. You asked me about challenges, and this was one of them. When I first read The Fig Tree, obviously I was aware that Safet, Jadran's father, is speaking Nashki, as Goran says, or Bosnian, as I have to name it at parts in the text. And I understood that because of my knowledge of languages and because of context. But actually putting those words in English translation on the page was a lot more difficult for me because I don't know Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian. I haven't learnt that language. I just understand from my knowledge of Slovene and Slavonic languages in general. And so when there was particular kind of colloquial phrases, I really had to do a lot of research, and I had to ask Goran, and sometimes I would ask Goran, okay, how would you say this in Slovene? And he would say, quite rightly, I wouldn't really say that in Slovene. And that is, of course, the reason why he wrote it in Nashki in the first place. So, I wanted to make sure that some of that multilingual fabric was visible, whilst at the same time recognising that flow is really important in this novel as well. There are some amazingly long, meandering sentences, and that was always something I tried to keep in mind and kept reading aloud to myself to make sure I was maintaining that same flow throughout the text.
And what are you both working on next?
Would you like to go first, Goran? You've probably got more exciting projects than me.
Well, part of my projects I had to postpone them, so I'm working on a documentary film which is already being postponed about European basketball championship which Slovenia won 3 years ago, and it was planned to be premiered this September, but now we postponed it for at least a year. But of course you are much more interested in what I'm doing in literature, and I can say that I'm actually finishing my new novel, which is almost done, and it's something also completely different. I always like to surprise my readers and translators, of course, and I'm hoping that it will be published in spring. So that's like huge thing for me, because it's almost 5 years since I published The Fig Tree, so it never took me longer to produce the new work, and I didn't really believe that I will manage, but luckily I almost did. So yeah, and then I'm writing some smaller stuff. I'm actually writing some scripts. Actually, there is a film based on my script that should start shooting every day now, but they are waiting for the Ministry of Culture or actually the government to release funds for filmmakers. So yeah, we are doing one graphic novel. Actually, I wrote it, and now it's being in a process of making. The illustrator is the strip artist is actually in the middle of the work, and so yeah, I'm being forced to do many different things at once. Since I finished my graduation as a film director, but somehow I got used to it, and I enjoy it. So yeah, but I think the more and more the time pass, I see that what I do do with more passion. It's literature, and what I do most seriously, and what I'm also most proud of, it's my literature. So that's why I would say that this novel I'm finishing is actually the moment the biggest thing.
But given your film credentials, are there any plans to turn The Fig Tree into a film?
Actually, they are making the theater play right now at the moment.
Wow, that would be an epic.
Yes, because Fig Tree has been chosen to for graduate students of for high school for the essay, graduation essay, or how do you call it in, I don't know, in English.
I think we might say that it's like the set reading, it's like the set text for students.
Yeah. So this is quite a big thing and a huge compliment for the book and for me, but it's also brings then obligation to visit a lot of school and talk to kids, and of course a lot of kids will not write an essay as they would like to write it, so probably they will hate me till the rest of my life. But yes, one of the things is also that they decided to make a theater play based on it. But for so far, nobody contacted me about the film. Actually, we are trying to get funds for the film based on my second novel, Yugoslavia, My Fatherland, at the moment. I co-wrote the script there, and it's in the process of making, and I hope we will get the funds this or the next year. But for now, The Fig Tree remains, let's say, untucked by filmmakers.
And Olivia, what do you have next?
Well, like Goran, I juggle a couple of things at once. Sadly, I can't translate Slovene literature full time. So at the minute, translation-wise, I've actually just started a new project with the British Centre for Literary Translation, where for 4 months I'm going to be translator in residence there, which means I have this wonderful opportunity to have a platform where I can organise events that are designed to raise the profile of the work of literary translators, and also talk a bit about what I do, so maybe kind of raising the question of how translators from so-called small languages work in the UK. So I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that. And my projects were inspired by my work on The Fig Tree. I had this idea. I wanted to have a theme of translating generations and think about what we inherit from previous colleagues, translators. What is there still left to do? So thinking about what would I still like to translate from Slovene literature that hasn't yet made it to a UK or US audience, and also encouraging people to think, what would we pass on? So kind of this thinking about the continuation between generations of translators. So yeah, that's what I'm about to get started on.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much. So could we finish with a short reading in Slovene and then English, if that's all right?
I'll just start to read, and then you will hear the English text later and understand what it's about. Ko se je mesec dni zatem peljal v Momjan, je bil upokojen. Bila je jesen in nebo se je povesilo. Svinčeni oblaki so se naslonili na krošnje in megličast pršec je vlažil cestišče. Pogled iz avtomobila je bil preslikava njegovega počutja. Vse okoli njega se je pogrezalo in on se je pogrezal sam vase. Pozno poletna otožnost se je zavlekla v jesen in prinesla slutno konca. Zdelo se mu je, da se pelje naravnost vanj, z vsakim ovinkom mu je bil bliže. Njegovo življenje postajalo za njim. Njegovo življenje je bilo preživeto. Vdihnil je, kar se je udalo vdihniti, in ostal mu je le še dolg, boleč izdih. Z njo, ki ni bila več ona. Vse počasneje je vozil in si podaljševal pot do cilja. Nikamor ni več hotel prispeti, nikogar srečati. Za hip si je zaželel, da tudi nje ne bi bilo in bi ga v Momjanu pričakala prazna hiša, v katero bi poniknil. Če bi bila tam ona, njegova Jana, bi bilo morda drugače, a ta, k kateri se je peljal, ni bila ona. Njega je bilo strah, ker ni razumela, kaj je govoril, ko nič ni govoril. Ni se mogel navaditi njenega pogleda, ki ga ni znal prebrati. To je bil pogled pozabe. Koliko njega je že pozabila, koliko ga še bo. Koliko njiju je sploh še ostalo za tem pogledom zdaj, ko ni v njunem življenju ničesar več razen njiju. Ničesar ni, le še ona dva sta, ona z njim in on z njo. In zdaj tudi to izginjanje knje v njej, dokler ne bo povsem izginilo in bosta ona in on obstajala le še zanj, kakor lep, žalosten privid.
1 month later, he made the journey to Momian as a retired man. It was autumn, and the sky hung low. Leaden clouds were supported by the crowns of trees, and the road was damp with misty drizzle. His emotions were rendered in the landscape outside. Everything around him was sinking, and he was sinking into himself. The late summertime melancholy had dragged on into autumn and hinted at an ending. It seemed as if he were driving directly towards it, every turn taking him closer, while his life was left behind in the distance. His life had already been lived. He had inhaled all there was to inhale, and a long, painful exhale was all that was left. With her, but without her. He was driving slower and slower, and his destination grew further away. He no longer had any desire to arrive anywhere. He no longer wished to see anyone, ever. For a brief moment, he wished he could arrive in Momian to an empty house where he could hide away. If she, his Jana, were there, maybe things would be different. But the person he was driving to see was not her anymore. He was afraid of her, because she didn't understand what he was saying when he said nothing at all. He couldn't get used to the look in her eyes, a look he couldn't read. It was the look of memory lost. How much of him had she already lost? How much more was there to lose? How much of the two of them remained behind those eyes now, when all that they had was each other? There was nothing else, only the two of them left, her with him, and him with her. And now that was vanishing somewhere inside her too, until it would disappear completely, and he and her would only exist for him, as a beautiful, sorrowful apparition.
Oh, I'm so glad you picked that passage, because I haven't said it in the interview, but I have said it in my review, that I thought your depiction of someone with memory loss from the perspective of the husband was, I think, some of the most moving writing I've ever read on the subject. I thought it was absolutely superb. So I'm so glad that you gave us a flavour of that, because it's really, really terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and for giving us invaluable insight into the fig tree.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
The Fig Tree is published by Istros Books and is available from online outlets such as Waterstones, Foyles, Daunt Books, Hive and Amazon. To buy The Fig Tree from your local independent bookseller, you can find your nearest store by visiting booksellers.org.uk/bookshop search. This podcast is brought to you by BookBlast. For more bookishness between episodes, visit online journal The BookBlast Diary or find us on Twitter at BookBlast. Special thanks to sound editor Rupert Such, theme tune composer Edward Campbell, author Goran Vojnović, translator Olivia Hellewell, and interviewer Lucy Popescu for taking the time to do the interview. And thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the BookBlast podcast.